Good morning, ladies and germs. I want to, this mask thing. People say, oh, no, this shouldn't be political. But then we have an epidemiologist who on Twitter yesterday actually said, oh, no, public health is political. Well, public health should not be political. I understand that everything these days is political, especially in the hyper-politicized world we live in now. So let's back out from the hyper-politicized world we live in now, and let's take a look at a study that was done. And by the way, this isn't the only one. There's several. But this one was done in the 1980s. And this is, of course, before the early 1980s, right around 1980, before HIV and the politicization of AIDS came into the game. This was a time when people were a little more sober about such things. We have had several people who have piped up on Twitter and elsewhere and have said, oh, but, you wouldn't want a surgeon operating on you without a mask in the operating room. Well, actually, I would. And before you recoil in horror, folks, realize that for 100 years, we have had this paradigm that doctors wear masks because they protect against infection. And by the way, they don't protect against the doctor getting infected. They protect against you getting infected. That's called source control. That's what everyone's talking about. And it is just taken as a standard article of faith that they work, that they actually prevent infections in patients. This is the premise upon which all of the BS that's going on now with masks in the general public is taken, which, by the way, is flat out stupid because in a surgery theater, in an operating room, or if you've ever been in an ICU, I've been in a NICU before. Okay, you have to scrub in, so you're not just wearing a mask. You have to scrub under your fingernails. You use HIPAA. There's a whole ritual you go through where you essentially clean pretty much any part of your body that is out and exposed in the open, and then you cover your mouth and your nose. And this is thought of to be very highly effective against infections. And the idea behind the mask is not just what's on your fingers, which, by the way, we know is a problem, but what comes out your mouth and nose. I mean, it logically seems to make sense, right? And yet remember that for hundreds of years, physicians believed that disease was caused by evil spirits. In fact, the man who discovered hand washing was literally driven out of his practice and then driven insane by his colleagues who considered him to be a nut because he discovered that when he washed his hands between obstetrical procedures as he was delivering babies as an OBGYN, that the women that he was delivering the babies for did not die as often. And therefore, he made the hypothesis that it was the contamination between people with his hands that was causing them to get sick. Of course, this was against the orthodoxy, and he was drunned out of practice. And then ultimately, folks, he literally died in an asylum. Okay? All right, so I want to put this up here. This is a study. This is from the Royal College of Surgeons. Okay? And by the way, published in 1981. All right? Summary. No masks worn in not one operating theater for 6 months. There was no increase in the incidence of wound infection. But what? Okay. And this, folks, this is a controlled trial. This is a change of one variable in what is otherwise a standard procedure. You're going to be shocked at what they found when they did this. So since the appointment of a control infection sister in 1975, wound infections have been carefully monitored, both from the ward and the community. Swabs from discharging wounds are sent to microbiologists for culture. So we'll try to figure out exactly what this is, right? All right. So with the agreement, it was arranged that no mask should be worn in the theater for 1 month during 1980. Now remember, this is a sterile field. This is a place where everything, to the best of your ability, is kept sterile. And yet, we're not going to wear masks. If there was a dramatic rise in wound infections, the trial would be discontinued. There was no initial rise in infections, so it was continued. And it went not for 1 month, but for 6 months. Okay? Nose and throat swabs were taken from all theater personnel monthly or whenever they had a cold. No other restrictions were imposed on taking movement beards or colds. In fact, the theater routine remained unchanged. The results: The throughput of the theater remained remarkably constant over the 5 years, except in 1976 when it was closed for 6 weeks. Notice here's the throughput. 1979 to 1980, 1,078 procedures, 1,049 procedures, wounds 435 procedures, 432. That's almost exactly the same. Infections 16 and 8. Wait, what? The infection rate went down by half. A very significant decrease. In fact, the p-value of that is, well, it's not quite in the realm of being hit by asteroids if it be chance, but that's really small. 5% probability that was chance. 5%. So, folks, can we stop with the BS? Because this is science. This is hard science. This is exactly the kind of controlled science that we occasionally do. We used to do it all the time. We don't do it anymore. Now it's all politics. There is zero evidence. Zero. If you cannot prove that masks work in an operating theater where everybody scrubs in, everyone's careful, the only change, folks, is whether or not your mouth and nose is covered. That's it. If that does not produce a higher infection rate, in fact, it produces a lower one, what does this tell us? Well, maybe it tells us that God was actually a little bit intelligent when he designed humans, and that the normal way that you breathe is through your nose, and the normal direction that you discharge whatever is in your nose is downward towards the floor where it doesn't hurt anybody. And as soon as you put a mask on, some part of that flow goes to the sides and is discharged in other directions. And that's bad. Gee, do you really think? Now remember, we're talking about asymptomatic people here, right? If you're hacking like crazy, you're obviously not going to be operating on people in a OR. But if you're hacking like crazy, then, gee, can't anybody that's around you know that you're hacking? Isn't it obvious that you are actively ill in some fashion? Well, yes, it is. The entire argument for mask mandates, folks, is that people who are asymptomatic, not doing anything, spread disease like crazy. And yet, here we are with an actual controlled trial in a hospital where everything is sterile and everything is controlled to be exactly the same, except for whether or not people wear masks. And the evidence is that masks not only don't work, but that they increase infection rates. Increase infection rates. In fact, they doubled them. Now, what did we see in Sevier County? Boy, let's look. Here's a Sevier County goat rodeo. Mask mandate was put in place. The order was issued on the 10th of July. This is the 7-day moving average case growth rate in percentage on the left-hand scale. These are the total number of active cases in the county on the right-hand scale. Active cases, by the way, is somewhat of a bullshit measurement because the way the state defines that is that 14 days after you've had a positive test, unless you die, or if you have a negative test, one of those two events occurs, then you're considered not active anymore. It's kind of a effed up way to think about it if that's... I'm not so sure that I agree with this methodology, but this is what they do, okay? So, we're charting this. All right. So anyway, but positive test is positive tests, and 5 days after the mandate went into place, a declining 7-day moving average rate reversed. Here's the 15th. Started to move upward. In fact, it more than doubled. Now, this is, again, daily case growth rate in percentage. And remember, what we're talking about when we're talking about epidemiology is we're talking about percentage changes. Absolute raw numbers are not really all that useful. Percentage changes, however, are very useful. Very good trend following indications. And so here we are, and we went all the way here, folks, to the end of the month before it turned around. Okay, and why did it turn around? Because right here is where we reach the suppression rate. We're going to get to that because that's what most of this video is about. But remember, what the study said in the operating room was that wearing masks doubled the transmission rate of disease in the operating room. Now, granted, it's a relatively small number of transmissions, but there were twice as many when the surgeons were wearing masks as there were when they weren't. And what did we have happen here? We had almost an exact doubling in the infection rate. Uh-oh. Oh, God, you don't want to... You wouldn't really want to... Really? See, this is why you actually have to look at science. Because if you don't look at science, you look at politics, you do things like put in mask orders, and then you make people sick, like our goat rodeo inbred mayor, Larry Waters. Yeah. And by the way, who is pushing all these lockdowns and things? Well, there's quite a decent amount of investigative journalism that was done that pointed directly at the Communist Party of China. They wouldn't want to really screw America, would they? Oh, no. Z would never want to do anything like that, especially after all the tariffs. Oh, wait a minute. They did have a motive, didn't they? You have to wonder about this. And oh, by the way, was it just in America? Of course it wasn't. It was all over the world. Who resisted? Sweden. And we know what happened there. Nice outcome for them, not so much for the rest of us. Okay, let's go look at the states. Here's Tennessee. As you can see, we have rolled over. We are now down our peak case rate. Well, I think that's all late reporting. But if you look at the 7-day, we are about 2,500. We are now down to close to half of that. Okay, so we've rolled over here. We've rolled over here, and death is starting to fall off as well. Now, of course, you have late reports and things like this, but that's usually what happens. Death comes behind hospitalizations. Hospitalizations come behind cases. Now, I want you to pay very close attention to something that's quite important here. When did this rise really start to get going? About here, right? I mean, we were kind of sort of stable here, and then here we go up to the peak. How much time went on here? How much time was involved in this? 6 weeks, right? Almost exactly 6 weeks. No, we're testing like crazy, but the positivity rate's coming down because we're testing people who don't actually have it, which is stupid, by the way. It's a waste of time, money, and resources, especially when you don't get the results back within 10 or 15 minutes. But, hey, listen, this is a great scam for all of the labs. They make a lot of money. But 6 weeks, okay? I want you to look at very carefully at some of these, okay? Here's Florida. Same deal, okay? Their case rate has collapsed. They are now down here in the area of about 4,000 cases. They're down by 66% from the peak. Of course, they're a little bit further in that they're 2 weeks later. So Tennessee, 2 weeks from now, probably be down about a third of where they were before. All right. This is by the way, this is called Farr's Law. This curve is very, very, very familiar to anybody that actually does anything called study, which most of these clown faces don't. And as you can see, Florida has now passed the death peak as well, which comes a couple of weeks after the peak in hospitalizations. So you get the hospitalizations, and then 3-4 weeks later, people stop dying. All right. But again, what is the time here from here to here? Well, we could go full range on this, and you'd see if we did that, we'd be right around the beginning of June, right, is when it started to accelerate. And when did it end? 6 weeks. Huh. And what do we got in Arizona? Same pattern. Okay? And again, if we go full range, where did it start? Just before the end of May. And where did it peak? 6 weeks. And look at this. How about South Carolina? Well, South Carolina, when did they peak? Right around the middle of July. And when did they start? Right around the beginning of June, right? 6 weeks. Mississippi. What? Mississippi's not done? Why isn't Mississippi done? Well, are they done or aren't they done? I'm not really sure. But let's take a look at the numbers. And the answer is, yeah, they are. But that doesn't mean you can't have a few, you'll have places where people didn't get it, counties here and there, all right? But look at what's happened here. We're down, even given this little move upward that we've had. Okay, where are we? We're half of where we were near the top. Testing rates roll over, hospitalizations, and deaths. And we're a little over 2%, 2.2%. But again, where did this come from? Let's back this back out. Where did it come from? Okay, here is the peak in July. Right at the beginning of June, right? We had this kind of gradual thing, and then, boom, 6 weeks. Look at the pattern. Isn't the consistency interesting? Georgia, same deal, rolled over exactly as I predicted. Remember, there were people, Boy, oh boy, I got a couple of people when I put the last video up there. Oh, no, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. You're going to be wrong. You're going to be right. Am I wrong? Don't think so. Where did Georgia actually peak out? Right here on August 11th. And let's go down here. Here's August 11th. 222,588. And where did that happen? Right at 2%. Right here. 2.1%. Now, if you want to, we can go back here and we can say, well, this is a rounded top. The real peak, the real actual peak was probably back around in here. Okay, so July 21st. So we'll go back a little further, and you'll find that it's even less because there's 148,000. You got 10.6 million people. So that's 1.6, 1.7%. But, it kind of hung on for a little while before it started to drop, right? The thing is, you get over 2%, and what happens? The virus is unable to continue to find an exponentially expanding group of hosts. Huh. And what's happening here? Hospitalizations. Really, we probably ought to look at when that rolled over as a more decent indication, right? Which would be right around the 4th of August. How about Texas? Texas was going to, oh my God, it was a disaster on July 27th. On July 27th right here. And oh, by the way, how long did this go on? Shall we look again? How come that was about 6 weeks? Was it about 6 weeks? It was about 6 weeks. And what's happened since? Oh my God. Another example. And what do we got here? July 23rd. So we'll go back here, July 23rd. And you know what's interesting about that? So if you go to July 23rd, their prevalence was about 1.21% on that day. Now, as it turns out, if you go up here, okay, and you look at this, it's considerably higher. It's now you're at 5.77, right? But that's clearly not the case. But again, we got this rounded top here, right? So I mean, where would you like to look at? Let's. Why don't we take, say, for example, just a few days ago, and so 542,000 cases. Which is, I'm being very nice here to the people who want to scream about this. And the thing is that even then, where are we? We're at 1.81. And yet, what do we got here? We got a nice little rollover. And, oh, by the way, there goes the hospitalizations, and what's going to be right behind that is deaths. Huh. Not so bad, eh? Not so bad. Louisiana, same deal. All right? Again, this was one that the last couple videos I said, hey, I might be wrong. Because we were seeing it get right up against that 2% barrier. And by God, when it did, okay, here we are, July 26th, okay, which, by the way, is right about when the hospitalization peaked out too, right? So let's go back to July 26th, right here. And that one actually got to just over 2%, 2.3% when that peaked. Because we're now, assuming that 2020's estimate is accurate, and again, these are estimates because the census isn't in yet, but the estimate is 4.6 million people, 107,000 cases. All right? Now, of course, people say, well, but people keep getting it. Well, of course people keep getting it, but the damage being done is basically over. All right, now, are there still people going to get it? Of course there's people still going to get it. It's stupid to think that they won't. Let's look at North Carolina. Where's North Carolina? Oh, wait, is North Carolina done? Well, I don't know. North Carolina is interesting. Why? Because when you look at North Carolina right now has 155,000 cases. Okay, right there. All right. And 10.5 million people. So they're about 1.5, which means they're probably going to get this rounded top because they're not quite to that 2% threshold yet. And yet, hospitalizations have rolled over. Death is rolling over. Okay, now is it zero? No, but it is. Hospitalizations, death are rolling over, and they're not quite to 2%, but they will be soon. All right. How about Alabama? Alabama's 115,000 cases. Okay, how terrible is that? Well, I don't know. Alabama has 115,000 cases and 5 million people. That's just. And what happened here? Boom, right? Same thing here. Guys, and again, dates. When did they peak? July 20th, which means like right around June 1st, right? So they had like this little ramp, and then oh, it's over. No, it's not, because you didn't get to the 2% threshold, and you had this ramp upwards. 6 weeks. Arkansas. Arkansas is kind of interesting because Arkansas has about 3 million people and about 56,000 cases. So, we can do math, right? Right. So they're not quite to 2%. And they're also not quite done, it would appear. Now, remember, Arkansas, what did Arkansas do not all that long ago? They put a mask mandate in, didn't they? How'd that work out for them? Not so good. See, should have left it alone, boys and girls. Why? Because the evidence is that they increase infection rates. Illinois is not done. Why is Illinois not done? Because Illinois is not to 20% yet, or 2%. 2% actual, 20% implied. That's 10 asymptomatic infections for every one that you actually measure. All right. Now, how about South Dakota? Oops. Remember what I said about a week ago that with Sturgis? Because they were so low in their prevalence that they were going to have a problem. Well, how'd that prediction work out? It wasn't because they had Sturgis. Yeah, it was not because they had Sturgis. And then we have the poster child for stupid, which is Hawaii, which not only had very low prevalence, but put a mask order in July 1st. And by the way, would you please explain to me why now, 8 weeks later, remember, Surgeon General and the CDC, if you will just put on your masks, why in 6 to 8 weeks, this thing will be over. Well, actually, no. In 6 to 8 weeks, this thing will be over because you will reach suppression rates, and it has nothing to do with whether or not you put on a mask. And at this rate, Hawaii is now at 6,300 cases, and the problem they have is that they are nowhere near suppression. Okay, these guys, first off, I want to show you this here. Their data grade is not very good, meaning the quality is just kind of shitty. But, that's just kind of how that works. The thing that's interesting is that they are nowhere near a suppression rate with 6,300 cases. The state of Hawaii has about 1.36 million residents. And that's kind of interesting because that was as of 2010. The 2015 estimate was 1,431. So I'm not so sure what you're going to have in terms of 2020. We've got some estimates from the Census Bureau with regards to where we think this might actually be. And, we'll see where that ends up. But the thing is that with only 6,300 cases, that's going to be very small. The other thing, though, is that, and this is kind of interesting, is that Honolulu, which of course is the largest city, has 342,000 residents roughly, and that's an estimate off 2020. So if we were to look at that, that would be close to 2%. That's 1.86. And I'm wondering whether or not what we're seeing here is actually that essentially the outer parts of the state, the other parts of the state, are so undense that you're not going to see the kind of bombastic blow-up sort of thing. Or if you do, it'll be little blips because they underrepresent. And this is one of the things that's interesting about metro areas is that, Chicago, for example, is such a huge percentage of the population of Hawaii. Not Chicago proper necessarily as a city, but the general area. And that's true in a lot of states. New York is the same way. New York City, of course, the metro area is such a huge percentage of the total state population. But Hawaii is somewhat different in that it's an island chain. And so absent people getting on a plane and going from one island to another, while there is some cross-population, it's not as high as you might think. But the idea that you're going to manage to stop the spread of this virus in Hawaii with 6,300 cases and 1 million people on the islands is just ludicrous. You're not going to do it. And by the way, the governor puts his mask order in. He puts it in way back here, right? And what do we have here? At the time that this thing went into effect, we had about 30 cases that were showing up on a daily basis. And now we've got a case rate of roughly 300. Okay, we've got and a 7-day moving average, and that's very jumpy. But a 7-day moving average, it's in the low to mid twos. Obviously, masks did absolutely nothing. Of course, you'd expect, if you read that study on sterile fields and operating rooms, you'd expect them to actually make the situation worse, wouldn't you? Wouldn't that be what you'd take away from it? Huh. Well, if the goal, folks, is to slow down the spread so as to prevent hospitals from being overloaded, the last thing you want people to do in the general public is wear masks. That's all. I mean, hey, it only doubled the number of infections in operating rooms. I mean, if you don't want hospitals to be overloaded, you would think that the last thing you'd want to do is tell people to wear masks, right? Okay, finally, New York. Why is New York no spike? Well, because New York reached suppression before you could get one. They got into a suppression situation in April. And as a result, for them, it's over. Look at what's happened with them. Okay, steady decline. Now you got this flat line. Is it over completely? Are people not getting it? Well, no. People are getting it in New York State. People are getting it in every state. People are going to get it everywhere. People get colds. People get flus. People get bugs. But is there a public health emergency here? Absolutely not. The hospitalization rate from the end of May to today is a tenth of what it was. And the death rate is down into the fives, 4 and 5. Well, folks, everybody screams about death, but listen, over 8,000 people, in fact, close to 9,000 people a day die in America. 9,000. You say, oh, no, that can't be right. Sure it is. It's 2.8 million people a year, approximately. In my county here, it's about 800. That's 0.85% is approximately the death rate. And that's from all causes, everything. A huge percentage of the deaths that occur are the consequence of people's personal choice over the span of decades. Too much drinking, smoking, being fat, and therefore diabetic, which leads to kidney failure. It leads to all sorts of other bad things. Limb amputations, renal failure, kidney dialysis comes first usually. Renal failure, kidney dialysis, and then you die. This is not uncommon, okay? Heart attacks and strokes, a huge percentage of heart attacks and strokes are caused by lifestyle choices. There are, of course, always the incidents that are just nothing other than bad luck, right? A lot of cancer is caused by your personal lifestyle choice, but not all of it. Some of it is just caused because you get a bad draw in the genetic lottery. Okay, I happen to have relatively bad draw in the genetic lottery when it comes to my teeth. I will probably eventually end up with false choppers as a consequence of that. That's okay. This is, we're all individuals. We all get a different set of DNA, and as a result, our DNA controls to some extent what happens, but you can have a large influence on that by your own actions. But the fact of the matter is that what we're doing right now, folks, is stupid. There is evidence out there that we could stop the death, a lot of it, if we treated aggressively and early, and we treated for the virus. In addition, there is a fair amount of evidence, not a huge amount, but a fair amount, that we can interrupt a lot of the damage that that is serious, coronavirus infections cause. Again, not all of it. Trump now he's trumpeting convalescent plasma. Well, there's a problem with convalescent plasma. It sounds like a great idea. You take the antibodies, plasma of somebody who has antibodies, and you give it to somebody who doesn't have antibodies. The antibodies would tend to be protective. The problem with this is that because you are talking about an infusion, the person is in a hospital. And because that person is in a hospital, the disease is already well progressed and viral replication is complete. And so you are trying to treat something after most of the damage has been done. This is backwards. I've said since this began, this is the reason Tamiflu, although it's available and prescribed in the United States, doesn't do very much. With viruses, you want to treat them early. You want to do things that interrupt or slow down viral replication. If you can do that, you improve outcomes. You improve them at dramatically lower cost, and you keep people out of the hospital. That is where the focus needs to be. Finally, I'll do just another note on this vaccine stuff, because it's the craze, of course. All right, folks, vaccine development, there is no shortcut to safe vaccines. Effectiveness is a different question. We may be able to answer that question sooner rather than later. Safety is not something you can shortcut. It will be years before we know whether or not a vaccine or vaccines for COVID-19 is safe. By that time, this infection is going to be a nuisance. Why? Because that's how viruses tend to work. They come through your community. You get partial or complete immunity from reinfection. If you get infected again the second time, after some period of time, months or a year later, it is less severe. Why is it less severe? Because the virus is mutated and because your T cells recognize what it is and stop it before it gets as out of hand as it did the first time. Now, is it possible that it works out the other way around? Yeah, it is. There are a couple of examples. Dengue fever is one of them. Dengue fever is a disease for which a second infection can be much worse than the first. If you want to know what kind of bad things can happen if you rush vaccines, Google up what happened in the Philippines with a dengue vaccine that was shoved through approval and given to children in the Philippines who had not previously had dengue fever, in a very badly misguided attempt to protect them. It resulted in a tremendous amount of severe disease and more than a few deaths. And this is why you don't short-circuit the process. There's not a certainty by any stretch of the imagination that's going to happen here, but it is a definite possibility. And there is no way to know if you short-circuit the safety protocols and the testing. You can't untake a shot, which is why my position has been and will continue to be that I do not care what the argument is. I will not take a coronavirus vaccine personally. You may see it differently. On the other hand, I have none of the listed comorbidities that make you more likely to die in New York. I looked at the death data out of New York. It's available online. It's public. And if you do not have any of those things and you are in my age bracket, you have 1/50th the odds of dying as if you do have one or more of them. In other words, it cuts the risk of death for someone in my age cohort by a factor of 50. Well, I'm not scared at that 1/50th level at all. And so I have no reason to deal with this so-called vaccination, because for me, it is much more likely that the vaccine will get me than that the virus will get me. That's my calculation. Now, yours may be different. But that is how vaccination and how the calculation, whether or not you take a vaccination, should work. Do you believe? And again, when you're talking about small odds, we are talking about, that's exactly what we're talking about, small odds here, okay? And humans tend to be very bad at evaluating small odds. But when you're talking about small odds, the question is it more likely that the vaccine is going to harm you, or is it more likely that the disease is going to harm you? And that's how you make your choice. And remember, if the vaccine is only 50% effective, then the odds that the disease will harm you is only cut in half by taking the vaccine. It's not cut to zero. You'd have to have a 100% effective vaccine, and there is no vaccine that is. So you need to take that into consideration. But at the same time, folks, go back to the beginning of this video and watch that little piece again about masks. Because this is the kind of politicization, this is the kind of BS that you're being fed by our government and by so-called scientists. These people know this literature is out there. It's been out there. That was a 1980s, early 1980s study, 1981, when it was reported out and printed. We are 40 years beyond that point. And yet we are promoting and demanding what amounts to witch doctor material that, according to the data, increases your risk of disease, not decreases. Now, maybe the risk is small, but an increase is an increase. And yet that's what you're being told to do. If you cannot trust our government and your officials to tell you the honest truth about how to reduce your risk when it comes to something as simple as wearing a diaper on your face, why would you believe them when it comes to a vaccine for the same bug? I'm your Chica Guy.